There's a very nice quote that says that our life is lived between B and D, birth and death, and that what lies between is C for choice. But to be honest, I think that the more accurate truth is that we tend to live our lives at A, on autopilot. We like the idea of being in control, but what we don't realize is that usually we're not choosing those emotions, those responses. It's our brain's neural pathways that are doing that for us. I don't mind thinking in a negative way if that's what I mindfully choose, but I don't want my brain making that decision for me. There's nothing wrong with getting angry, but I want it to be mindful anger. I want to choose it. I don't want it to choose me. Reactions are just the brain's way of being efficient. So they're usually not mindful, conscious choices. They're just our brain being efficient. After years of predicting, our brain has us figured out. It predicts, we react. It's always making those choices for us based on what it has on file, on past experiences. And when we repeatedly behave or think a certain way, well, it's going to assume that we're going to do it again. So it's a good idea to start thinking about those reactions as something that, it's our brain taking away that freedom of choice from us. When we say, oh, this person pushed my buttons, well, those buttons are really neural pathways in your brain that were activated. It's your brain taking that neural highway most traveled, so that in less than a nanosecond, you're in that familiar state of anger or annoyance. When people, situations, memories, experiences from the past trigger us and make us react in a way that leaves us feeling powerless and depleted, well, it's because those reactions are taking away our power to choose how we want to respond. With the help of mindfulness, many clients find that they can start to take back control so that they can start making more conscious choices. So a good place to start is just observing that you that's reacting without feeling that this mindful observation means that you have to do anything about that reaction, change it in any way. No, you're just observing. Now, it could be that after some time of observing this you start thinking, gosh, do I want to, react this way for the next 20 years? Maybe you're getting a little tired of making, of the fact that this person is making you feel or think a certain way. Or maybe you're okay with 20 more years of reacting that way. The good thing is that the observer in you isn't going to judge you either way, but it will give you an opportunity that if you find that, okay, you'd like to start taking back some of that power, well, that there's, it's going to support you in doing that, make you more mindful. We so often think that, our reactions are just like a natural part of us, so natural that they go unquestioned. But, the truth is that we have far more control than we realize. Go-to reactions are just shortcuts that make our brain lazy. So insisting on mindful choice is good for the brain because it makes it work harder. It challenges your brain. Remember that mindfully wielding your power to choose your response, well, That's what trains your brain to give you a choice. So let's say that your brain has this very ingrained neural association between irritation and your mother-in-law. So that just seeing her face just triggers this irritation in your body without, giving you the chance to think about whether you want that irritation to spoil that moment or not. Well, if you'd like to react in irritation, fine. But let's say you're tired of feeling irritated every time you have to see your mother-in-law or when you even think about her. And you decide that, what? I want to start responding in a different way, in a way that doesn't end up leaving me so tired and cross and just out of sorts and disempowered. Okay, well, that's good. Ask yourself, well, how do you want to respond instead? Let's say that after some thought, you think, okay, detached calm. Well, have you ever felt that way towards your mother-in-law? If you haven't, well, then how is your brain going to take a neural pathway that doesn't exist? In order to interrupt that irritation, you have to present your brain with more attractive options. You have to start building the neural pathways that are going to give it more attractive options so that it quits taking that road most traveled, the only one you've given it, the one that it's used to taking, the pathway to irritation. So, how are you going to start building that neural pathway to detached calm? Well, the first thing you do is tell your brain, you know what? Stop predicting me. Stop predicting that every time I see my mother-in-law, I'm going to react with irritation. And then through the magic of visualization, mental rehearsal, or self-hypnosis, or just plain old imagining, you're going to start rehearsing that response, that detached calm. What does it feel like, look like, sound like? How are you going to be speaking to her? How are you going to be, feeling? What does that detached calm really feel like in your body? What is it that you're telling yourself that lets you know that you're feeling that detached calm? You're going to do that in a very detailed way, and you're going to do it a lot. Because remember, through repetition is how we're going to make that neural pathway strong, how we're going to make it a real attractive option for your brain to take. So that after a while, your mind is going to start asking you, well, what path do you want to take? How do you want to respond? And then you can ask yourself, well, okay, how do I want to respond? With irritation or with detached calm? And then you can choose. But regardless of what you choose, there's just that sense of empowerment knowing that you chose that response and not your brain. One of the best ways to keep preventing those reactive behaviors, feelings, and thoughts is to keep surprising the heck out of your brain. Don't let it think it has you figured out. Use a little mindfulness to get yourself off autopilot. And you know what? Next time your brain predicts trepidation, choose calm. Choose to respond with ease when it would have predicted a reaction of unease. Choose a little bit of happiness when your brain would have predicted a little bit of sadness. I know that when I finally understood that when I react to anyone or anything, that I'm literally handing over my power, my right to choose, my precious energy to that trigger, well, that was a life-changing moment for me. Yes, it can take resolve and practice time to build those alternative neural pathways, those alternative ways of responding. But it can be so worth our time and effort, because that sense of empowerment that we feel when we're able to choose our responses instead of just reacting, well, that can be a life-changing moment for you as well. If you would like to get started on that path to responding instead of reacting, try something that I have many clients do. I encourage them to begin conversations in their head, any sentence, with 2 words that I find so empowering because they keep us living life mindfully at sea, for choice. And the 2 words are, I choose. Using these 2 words in your vocabulary, starting any sentence with I choose, any conversation in your head with I choose, well, that just keeps the neural network of choice and possibility strong. It can keep those not so good reactions at bay and keep feeding those good responses. So, for example, let's say that you're someone that usually reacts from a place of judgment and criticism, but would like to begin responding more from a place of greater love and compassion for yourself. Well, one of the things that you can do is to say every day, as often as you'd like, I choose to love and accept myself exactly as I am, because I have the power to do that. I choose to accept myself, and from this place, open to the possibility of loving myself more. What I do with clients is basically change work. They often contact me because they want to change something. Often it's a habit, something they habitually think, feel, or do that just isn't serving them. But my work has taught me that in order for change to take deeper root, it's a good idea to make peace, to accept whatever it is that we want to change. Now, that acceptance doesn't mean you're not going to do anything about that. Well, that's why clients come to see me in the first place. What it means, though, is to accept everything in the past that led to that not so good habit. Because when you can make peace with that habitual behavior, thought, or feeling, well, you can accept with more compassion the reasons why that behavior, that habit came into being in the first place. And I think when clients are able to do this, well, that just seems to give them more clarity, more peace, and makes them feel more determined, more ready to move forward and finally make that change. We tend to think of habits as bad. Eating too many sweets, not exercising enough, procrastinating. But really, habits are anything that we do repeatedly. The good and the not so good, which is why I like to remind clients to stay mindful if they find that they're repeatedly putting themselves down or judging themselves or others negatively, because these can become unconscious habits as well. Habits don't just create themselves out of thin air, of course. They start and are fed by repetitive thought patterns, repetitive self-talk that supports and keeps that habit going. Anything we repeatedly do, say, think, and feel gets embedded at a neurological level, but also at a subconscious one. Habits reside in the subconscious mind, which might be why you may not like a particular habit and you may want to change it, but our subconscious mind likes the familiar, and habits are familiar. So it may not be as interested in changing that habit as you are. It may resist that change. And it can be quite devious at helping us find excuses to postpone that change, especially if our fight or flight switch is turned on and our body is in survival mode. Because finding time to listen to that empowering talk, or taking a long bath, or going for a long walk, or finding the time to meditate, or even sit for a while and think about positive things. Finding the time to take all those steps towards change, well, all of these things don't necessarily protect us and make us run faster. They're not essential to survival. When my client tells me that they're feeling so stressed out, so overwhelmed by all those daily responsibilities that they just can't find the time to use the tools I give them to fit change into their busy schedules, I can so understand, and I tell them, listen, let's take a backdoor approach and begin to sneak that change in a little bit at a time. Change comes in all different sizes, and even in microdoses, it can begin to make a big difference. Sometimes, in order to lay the foundation for those bigger changes, we need to start laying the groundwork for the tiny ones first. And so change, your goal, doesn't have to be a big headliner. That habit you want to change can just be, well, changing one habitual thought at a time. And one by one, this can add up to a lot. What I have learned during the course of my work is that even bad habits can have good intentions, which is why I refer to them as not so good habits instead. Let's say that you're someone who's in the habit of having ice cream for dessert every night after dinner. And one day you want to change that. You want to stop eating so much ice cream. Well, if you were my client, I would ask you, would you consider making peace, accepting that habit first? If the answer is yes, then I would have you ask that habit, ask the part of you that keeps that habit going, a curious question. What is it that you want from me? What is it that you want to get from me by making sure that I have that treat every night? The answer, as it does many of my clients, might just surprise you. Perhaps all that habit wants is just to get you a little love or peace or happiness. Maybe what it wants is just to reward you for having to put up with so much stress during the day. Discovering the good intention behind any habit is often what paves the way for greater understanding, acceptance. Because when we can finally understand, accept the reasons why this not so good habit came into being, well, that's often what allows us to finally let it go, to say farewell to that not so good habit and begin to make that change. If you're less than satisfied with a part of you that's in the habit of shopping too much, eating too much, biting your nails too much, well then consider asking the part of you that keeps that habit going that same curious question. What is it that you want from me? And then exploring those answers with as much wise understanding, non-judgment, and compassion as you can. Another thing that I encourage clients to do, and I would really encourage you to do as well, is to forgive that habit. Forgive the reasons that created it. Forgive the part of you that keeps it going. Because when we can forgive those not so good habits, well, that can lead to so much more peace in our hearts. When we forgive ourselves repeatedly, when we love ourselves repeatedly, despite those not so good habits, we're creating amazing habits like forgiveness and self-love. I also encourage clients to replace those not so good habits with ones that serve them better. Otherwise, unconsciously, they could replace them with another not so good habit. So if you decide to drop an old, outdated, limiting habit, just make sure that you're prepared to replace it with one that makes you feel empowered. What we repeatedly say to ourselves, to others, can become a way of speaking, a habit of speech, so that the words are out of our mouths before we can even decide if we really want to say them. Repeated habitual ways of speaking can become unconscious shortcuts that if they make us feel good, fine. But what tends to come out of our mouths is more negative than positive. I'm no good. I'm an overeater. I'm a procrastinator. I'm a failure. So I like to remind clients to stay mindful so that what follows those two words, I am, isn't something negative. Because repetition can make these disempowering statements habitual patterns. They can resonate in a way that feels permanent, leaving little or no room for the possibility of change. Repeatedly saying or thinking something about ourselves can become a habit, and habits can create labels, and labels make the brain lazy. These negative descriptions of ourselves may ring so true that we think nothing about saying them, but repetition can plant these into the subconscious mind and grow them as beliefs. And these beliefs can manifest as automatic thoughts. And these automatic thoughts can keep growing those disempowering neural networks that keep us feeling limited and giving the brain no choice but to predict that this is always how it's going to be. When we do anything out of habit, when we feel something out of habit, when we say something out of habit, what we're doing is we're reinforcing those neural networks and making the neural pathway most traveled even smoother and easier for the brain to take. So that really, I think that so much of our thinking, our very being, can go on autopilot. Sometimes I think that so much of who we say we are, what we think, what we do, becomes a conditioned response, a habit. Now, if these habits serve us and add value to our life, fine. But if not, well, mental rehearsal, hypnosis are certainly tools we can use to interrupt these automatic responses and help us to change. But a good place to start is with a little mindfulness. Now, as I've said before, mindfulness has no agenda other than to just allow us to observe without judgment. And when we can observe those habitual patterns, those habitual conversations, those habitual thoughts gently, the ones that keep us stuck in those not so good habits, well, the very quality of this benign observation can do more than you think. Because when you start pondering with curious mindfulness, am I doing this out of habit? Am I thinking this out of habit? Am I feeling this out of habit? Well, that alone can start bringing to light everything else in our life that's an unconscious habit, an unconscious pattern. And this can sooner or later start paving the road for change. Being mindful is just a way for us to keep telling our brain to take a detour called change. And remember that change can start by setting an intention to change one habitual, hurtful, critical thought that keeps us stuck in feeling, for example, not good enough. But first, I would encourage you to consider forgiving that thought, to acknowledge and accept the reasons that created it, and forgive yourself for thinking it. And once you've made peace with yourself, with that limiting thought, well, then think about what you want to replace it with. And once you stop or begin to think less and less of that old habitual thought, and you start thinking more and more of this new empowering thought that doesn't hurt your feelings, what you're doing is that you're weakening that old habit and strengthening this new empowering one that does make you feel good enough. If you'd like, think of something that you repeatedly tell yourself, a habitual thought that just leaves you feeling and behaving like you're not good enough. And then observe yourself with a gentle, non-judgmental curiosity, thinking this thought. How many times a day are you doing that? How many times a day are you listening to that thought? Saying that thought? For how long are you talking about it to yourself or someone else? And then write down the people, the events, the situations, the location that just seem to trigger that habitual thought. And what are you usually doing before or during the time when you're thinking this disempowering thought? And focus on how that thought is making you feel and where you're feeling it in your body. This is all, this mindful, wise observation is serving a very important purpose, because when you do decide what words and images you'd like to replace this habitual thought with, well, what you're going to do is you're going to be repeating this more empowering thought, if not more than at least as many times a day as you were repeating the old one, and under the same exact circumstances. And you're going to be feeling how good this new thought makes you feel. And you're going to be feeling it in the same exact place where you used to feel that old thought. And you're going to make your brain notice and study the difference. When you observe that old habitual thought that just seems to be clamoring for attention because it's noticing that it's got some competition, well, one of the things that you can do to put up a roadblock and interrupt it is to mindfully detach by reminding yourself, reminding that thought, you know what, you're just an old habit and I'm replacing you with one that feels better in my body. Or you can simply observe that thought and say something like, oh, there goes that old habit again, or though there goes my brain taking that old pathway. And you can even smile a little bit as you think this. Experiment and feel what wording works for you. Something that can help deflate, weaken the negative charge of that old thought. Or you can use that very effective CBT technique called thought stopping, where you just say the word stop. But whether you voice it out loud or silently, make sure that you use a tough love, no nonsense, forceful tone, like the kind you'd use if you saw a child wanting to cross the street without looking both ways first. Or you can visualize a big sign in red that has the word stop on it. Or you can visualize an image of you putting up your palm. Or you can imagine a big letter X and superimpose it on that thought. Or you can clap your hands loudly the moment you observe yourself having that thought and say the word stop. What you can do is to practice thinking that habitual, not so good thought, stopping it in its tracks and replacing it with a more empowering one. You can repeat this 3 to 5 times, and what this does is that it begins to train your brain to neglect the pathway that leads to that old disempowering habit, and it strengthens the detour that leads to the more empowering one. Something else that can work well is that when you observe that thought that you'd like to change, that you keep repeating to yourself, is just to set the intention to let it go in peace. So what you can do is just to take a nice deep breath, pause, and as you breathe out, just say to yourself, I'm letting you go. And then as you breathe mindfully in, you can just insert that new, more empowering thought that you want to keep repeating, that you want to make a good habit, and really feel it in your body. Feel the difference that it makes. Mindfulness can help divert the brain from taking those old pathways that just keep reinforcing those disempowering habitual patterns, and encourage our brain to form new synaptic connections, more feel-good habitual pathways. Remember that the better we get at observing, catching ourselves, speaking, feeling, thinking, and acting in a negative way out of habit, the more doable it becomes to begin weakening and eventually break one tiny, not so good habit at a time. And in this way, help us to begin building a solid foundation for good change. In the past, I was careful about voicing my negative thoughts because I didn't want to be judged and found guilty of being a negative person. And when people would say to me, oh, don't be so negative, I would feel compelled to defend my negativity. When I confessed to family and friends the fears that just fueled this negative thinking, they would often say, don't worry, it'll all be okay. But this was good advice I just couldn't take, which wouldn't have been so bad if I hadn't felt even worse for not being able to take that good advice. So when I learned that actually being negative is a very natural thing because our primitive brains have a built-in negativity bias, I felt so relieved, so vindicated. A lot of well-intentioned, positive, optimistic people can sometimes unintentionally make others who don't share their sunny outlook on iffy situations feel like their views, their way of thinking aren't good enough. But actually, those fears, those concerns just want to protect us. They want to help us stay alive, stay prepared. I don't think there's anything wrong with being negative per se, if that is what we mindfully choose. But I want to be able to choose that state of negativity. I don't want my brain to automatically choose it for me. I don't want it to become my default state. Because the thing is, if thinking negatively is all we do, it can limit our potential for possibility. I think that negativity can create these invisible boundaries in our mind that can cause us to, perceive our life in a smaller, more limited way. And I think that when we constantly dwell on the negative, well, our life tends to mirror that negativity. So I believe that balance is key. Balancing out that negativity with a little positivity can help bring us emotional equilibrium. When I started calling myself a negative person, is when I realized that I was sticking this label in my mind that was limiting how I was experiencing my life. When people told me I was negative, and I agreed, what I didn't realize was that I was keeping myself stuck in this mindset that wasn't allowing me to experience the opposite. I knew myself as a negative person, but I was beginning to get curious about wanting to live my life to my fullest potential. I wanted to see if I could go from experiencing life as a negative person to experiencing life as a person who was a little more positive. And this realization is what really motivated me to peel off that label, to change for the right reasons. Not because I thought there was anything wrong with me and I had to be more positive, or because I wanted to impress strangers, friends, family with my newfound positivity, but because I wanted to start perceiving my life, in a more balanced, limitless way. But I'm careful too about not sticking another label in my mind, that of being a positive thinker, an optimist, because I'm not. I'm a positive thinker until I have a negative thought, and I'm a negative thinker, a pessimist, until I have a positive thought. I go back and forth between these opposites. I can be very negative one moment and very positive the next. And usually I land somewhere in between. And I've made that perfectly okay. Change happened when I was able to accept my negativity. Understanding the reasons in my past why I had unconsciously wired my brain for even more negativity was really what helped me to accept the what is. And the what is was that I felt safer, more comfortable thinking that things would end badly. Decades of being afraid to be positive because I was afraid of being disappointed made me think it was safer to expect the worst. This wise understanding is what allowed me to accept this negativity with so much compassion and not judgment that it made me feel good enough. I think that if the goal is to become a little more positive, we're better served to just first try and accept ourselves as we are. Now, this doesn't mean that we're going to resign ourselves to stewing and chewing on the negative, but it does mean that we're going to try and just stop fighting the reasons that negativity exists, honoring those reasons. Because making peace with the reasons we're negative is often what can help us move forward and become more of who we want to be. I think that the part of us that seeks to protect us in some way by thinking in a negative way just wants to be acknowledged and accepted. Perhaps resisting it, judging negatively that part of us that is negative isn't the best strategy. Because when we don't judge ourselves or judge our thoughts as being less than because they're negative, well, this can feel so accepting, so relaxing. And it's this relaxation, this acceptance that can often free up more energy inside of us to be even more mindful about not allowing any one mindset to dominate or limit us in any way. I know that when I observe that part of me that still feels the pull of those worst case scenarios, I'll connect with it and I'll acknowledge it without judgment by saying something like, I feel you, I accept you, but you're not all of me and I'm not all of you. And I'm so much more than the sum of all my negative thoughts. And when I do this, when I say these words, well, it helps me to mindfully detach from my negativity. I encourage clients to connect with that part of themselves that wants to dwell on the negative with compassion, understanding, and begin a dialogue. If there's a part of you that's more comfortable being negative than with feeling positive, and you want to change this, well, I encourage you to connect with this part with loving kindness. And you can close your eyes, allow your breath to relax you, relax your mind, your body, your heart, and ask this negativity a curious question. What is it that you want from me? And if it, for example, wants to protect you in some way, take it a step further and ask, well, what is it that you want for me by protecting me? And chances are you'll probably arrive at a good intention, because believe it or not, you may just discover that your negativity has a good intention. And accepting this good intention can often make such a positive difference. The more we resist something, the more it just seems to persist. And when it comes to negative thinking, this certainly seems to be true. The more we try to not think a negative thought, to not pay attention to it, the more it just seems to taunt us. Listen to me, listen to me. So I teach clients that rather than struggle against those negative thoughts and exhaust themselves in the process, it's smarter to use a little mindfulness. Because mindfulness allows us to observe that negative mood, that negative thought, that negative attitude with a better understanding, a wiser one, of the fear that drives that negativity. Our brains may not have been created to be positive 24/7, But that doesn't mean we can't rewire them to support a more positive mindset. So if you find yourself ruminating over too many negative things, I'm going to offer some suggestions that have really helped me and many of my clients tame our negativity. The negative mind tends to be restless. So when you observe that restless mind wanting to constantly jump from one worrisome, unsettling, imagined catastrophe to another, take that restlessness, that restless energy, and try channeling it in the opposite direction. This may seem a little incongruous, a little challenging at first, but try taking 2 or 3 nice, mindful in-breaths, ones that just seem to revive you, and then slowly breathe out that negativity, that negative energy, until you feel a little bit more centered. And then get playful. Use your imagination and your sense of humor to make your mind teach your brain to jump from one funny, amusing, ridiculous, positive, over-the-top scenario or feel-good thought to another. When you observe your mind riding the runaway train to disaster, say something to yourself like, "Oh, I'm watching the catastrophe channel again." When I do this, I use a tone of patient amusement. If what you're imagining or thinking about is so ridiculously dramatic that it feels like you're watching a terrible movie, laugh. Injecting a little humor when your brain isn't expecting it is a great way to break that negative train of thought. So then you can imagine switching that channel in your mind to a more positive one. Something fun that I do with clients that can work really well is that I have them pick their favorite color. And then I have them set an intention that every time they see this color, could be a car, accessories, clothing, furniture, food, towels, dishes, anything in nature, in their outer environment, they're going to think a positive thought or bring up a positive memory, image, or feeling. And they tell me that suddenly they're spotting this color everywhere. And that's probably because they're training their brain to go in search of the positive, to find that color and get that reward, get those feel-good hormones flowing. If you'd like, you can try this. Pick a color that makes you smile and set that intention that anytime you see something in that color, you're going to think or imagine a positive thing. But you have to do this every day, even when you're not in the mood, because this is what's going to get those neurons to fire and wire together and start creating that neural association that's going to begin linking that color with something positive. Make this a feel-good game, and you may just be surprised at how often you're going to start noticing that particular color. Whenever you hear or say or think a scary thought that leaves you feeling disempowered, practice immediately afterwards beginning a conversation with yourself that's going to empower you right back. If you have a power image, bring it up. If you have a power statement, repeat it with verve. I've talked about using the word stop when a negative thought shows up in our mind. Practice giving your brain a command using words like cancel or delete anytime a negative thought flashes across your mind. If you'd like to balance out that negativity with a little positivity, whenever you have a negative thought, follow it with 2 positive thoughts. Since the brain is skewed towards the negative, it's going to take 2 positive thoughts to balance things out. And if you're someone like me, it's going to take 3 positive thoughts, because I like to keep the brain even busier, more on task, looking for the positive. Investing more energy, putting more attention on the positive thoughts we just had rather than the old negative one can help us let go of a little bit of that negativity. Now remember that the brain learns through repetition. So this is something that you want to do not just occasionally, but as often as you can. And I know it can seem a little tiring to do this, but repetition can grow a good habit. And as that positive neural network grows, you may just find that you need to do this a lot less. Sometimes those negative thoughts just seem to come out of nowhere, and they start clamoring for our attention, begging to be indulged, begging for an argument. And too often we give in and spend valuable energy either justifying them or convincing ourselves that they're not true. I like to think of automatic negative thoughts, or ants as they're commonly referred to, as these pesky fire ants. And I've learned that when I observe them without judgment, I keep a mindful distance, I avoid engaging them and simply allow them to come and go in peace, well then they can't harm me. Even though my brain feels much more comfortable believing in those positive case scenarios, that doesn't mean I still don't have catastrophic thoughts, unnerving, ugly thoughts. But I've become much better at leaving them alone. Now, instead of engaging them, arguing with them, well, I'll just observe them. And it's this patient, wise observation that helps me to detach. And so it becomes easier to just allow them to come and go. Sometimes I'll have some really awful thoughts. And in the past, they would have left me feeling shocked, dismayed, disappointed, angry at myself for having them. But I've also learned to leave myself alone, to stop feeling guilty or blaming myself for having these thoughts. And it's, not judging myself negatively for having these thoughts that has really made a positive difference, because it just allows me to relax when I notice them. I'll see them, but I'll just refuse to humor them. And when I forget to do that or just plain don't want to, well, I forgive myself anyway. And I urge people to do the same. Remember that every moment that brings you a negative thought also brings you an opportunity to pass on the judgment, keep a mindful distance, and practice a little kindness, a little patient wisdom when you observe that negative thinking, and feel what a difference that can make. It helps to remind myself and other clients that as unsettling and scary as those ants can be, well, they're just thoughts. So sometimes I'll tell that ant, I see you, but I choose not to believe you because I can. Our thoughts are powerless unless we believe them. And it's good to remember that just because we think something doesn't necessarily make it true. And believing our thoughts is only a good thing if they make us feel good. When we're mindful about keeping our distance and staying detached, it becomes easier to diffuse the negative charge that just makes those negative thoughts feel so strong. And good ways to do this are, for example, if you register a negative thought, try saying something like, I see you, you're itching for my attention, but I'm not going to take the bait. Or what helps many clients is to think of their negative thoughts as objects moving across their mind like little planes whizzing by, or, imagining that their thoughts are these objects on a conveyor belt that are just going in and out of their awareness. I know that thinking of my negativity as this big, unruly dog helps, and I'll imagine pulling hard on that leash when it wants to stray too far down that scary path. Or I like to view myself as a babysitter, and my mind is this crawling baby that just wants to wander off and explore places it shouldn't. So I make myself patiently bring back that baby, my thoughts, back to the present moment where it's usually a lot safer. Or sometimes I'll just imagine that these scary negative thoughts are being dispersed, swept away by this calm, powerful wind that just seems to come from the power center in my heart. Get creative and try coming up with some metaphors, some phrases that can work for you. I think it's a good thing to remind ourselves that thinking more positive, optimistic thoughts is a choice that our brain can take away from us if we're always in the habit of thinking negatively. In order to weaken that habit and take back our freedom to choose, we have to make those neurons start to fire and wire positivity by practicing thinking more positive thoughts. Now, in the beginning, this was easier said than done, and rehearsing that positive dialogue in my head and allowing myself to feel more positive felt really strange because it was so unfamiliar to my body. When our negative thinking has its roots in a long ago past, well, years of feeling this way can make that negativity seem really familiar. I didn't like the worry that came with it. I didn't like how scared it made me feel, but it had become so natural, so accepted, that my subconscious resisted becoming more positive. And you know what? I realize now that I had formed an attachment to my negativity, to that negative narrative. So it took a while to start hardwiring a little more positivity in my brain and to become more comfortable feeling and thinking in a more positive way. But it became more doable when I approached what was driving that negative thinking from a higher level of consciousness. And I have to say it was well worth the time and effort, because today my frame of mind, the world inside me, feels so much more in balance, and I feel a greater sense of control because I'm able to respond to a negative mood, a negative thought, a negative imagining, instead of just reacting to it. If you're like me, who once thought that having a negative outlook on life and having modest expectations was a lot safer than getting my hopes up and trusting that optimism, I would say to you that becoming brave enough wise enough to cultivate a little more positivity and expect more from life is well worth the risk of disappointment. What we can gain from opening our hearts to experiencing that opposite can add so much wellness to our life. To end this series on rewiring the brain for greater wellness, I'd like to answer a question that someone once asked me. What does it take to make a beautiful brain? I thought it was a great question with many good answers depending on your point of view. But my reply was this: we don't need to think positively 24/7 or to do things perfectly. We don't need to have perfect success, perfect abundance. Things in our life don't have to be perfect. And we don't need to have a perfect past in order to cultivate a beautiful brain. I think that making our brain beautiful is more about being than doing or achieving. It's about being a little more loving, a little kinder, a little more patient towards ourselves, and being a little more forgiving, a little more understanding of all our imperfections, and growing that unconditional love and acceptance of ourselves despite all our foibles and imperfections and negativity, and digging deep to find the wisdom within us that enables us to do all of this is what can make our brain so beautiful. I hope that you've enjoyed watching this episode and that something I've shared can prove useful and add a little positivity, a little wellness to your life. If you have any questions or comments, please send me an email. Make sure to write Viking on the subject line. I'd love to hear from you.